Some men are believed because of who they are. Others are believed because of what they wrote down, even when no one wanted to read it. On the morning of March 14, 1997, Hollis Tate stood at the edge of his retirement ranch in Pinal County, Arizona, watching a young newspaper reporter walk up his dirt driveway. The reporter was carrying a microcassette recorder and a notebook. Hollis was 67 years old, retired 8 years from the Pinal County Sheriff's Department, and he had not given an interview to anyone since 1981. He had spent the previous night sitting on his porch with a cup of black coffee, listening to the AM radio reports of what people in Phoenix and Glendale and Prescott had seen the previous evening. He had not been surprised. Inside the cedar observation shed on the rise behind his house, the small structure he had built with his own hands in the spring of 1990, were 29 years of files. Manila folders, dated and indexed in his neat hand. Polaroid photographs in numbered envelopes. Audio cassettes of interviews with ranchers, truck drivers, copper miners, and night shift hospital workers. A wall map of Pinal County stuck with 1,247 small red pins. A logbook in the same handwriting that began on August 12, 1968. Before we begin, drop a comment with where you are watching from. And if stories of quiet witnesses being proven right after decades of ridicule speak to you, that subscribe button helps us keep telling them. Because what happened above the Arizona sky on the night of March 13, 1997, was not an anomaly. It was the highest data point in a record that one retired rural sheriff had been keeping, alone, since the year Project Blue Book had not yet been shut down. In the summer of 1968, the United States Air Force's official position on unidentified flying objects was that they did not exist. Project Blue Book, the public face of the Air Force's 21-year investigation into the phenomenon, was less than a year away from being formally terminated. The institutional climate around the subject in rural America at the time was an inheritance of three things at once. It was the inheritance of the 1947 Roswell incident and the press blackout that followed. It was the inheritance of the 1952 Washington national sightings and the official explanation of temperature inversions that even the radar operators present had refused to accept. And it was the inheritance of the Cold War, in which any anomaly in the night sky was treated by the federal government as a national security matter to be managed quietly rather than examined publicly. The pressure that flowed downward through this apparatus reached its lowest level in the form of small county sheriffs. When a rancher in Arizona or Wyoming or New Mexico called the local sheriff's office at 2 a.m. to report 3 orange lights moving in formation above his cattle pasture, the sheriff was expected to take the report, file it as a weather balloon or swamp gas or temperature inversion, and not pass it up to the state level for fear of inviting federal attention. Most sheriffs followed the expectation. The reports were lost. The witnesses were patronized into silence. The pattern that might have been visible from a county-level vantage was disassembled at the county level, one careful misfile at a time. Pinal County, Arizona, sits in the high desert basin between Phoenix to the northwest and Tucson to the southeast. Its eastern edge runs up against the Superstition Mountains. Its western edge is flat agricultural land along the Gila River. In the summer of 1968, the population was approximately 50,000, scattered across cattle ranches, copper mining settlements, and small farming towns. The county was crossed by Interstate 10 and bordered to the south by the restricted airspace around Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, and to the northwest by Luke Air Force Base near Glendale. It was, by geography alone, a corridor, a strip of dark night sky between two of the largest military aviation facilities in the western United States. Whatever was crossing that sky on a given night, official or unidentified, would be visible to ranchers who slept with their windows open. The man who answered the sheriff's office phone in Pinal County in the summer of 1968 was 38 years old. He had been a deputy for 13 years, and the county sheriff for 1. His name was Hollis Tate. He took the August 12th call from a rancher named Vic Calloway, with the same patience he brought to a stolen tractor or a domestic complaint, and he drove out the next morning to look at the burned ring in the dirt of Calloway's pasture. And he did not file the report as a weather balloon, and from that morning forward, nothing in his life would proceed the way the apparatus expected it to proceed. Hollis Tate had been born in 1929 in Globe, Arizona, the third son of a copper miner who had emigrated from Cornwall by way of Michigan. His childhood smelled of sulfur and warm tortillas, and the chemical tang of the smelter on the hill above the town. He left school after the 10th grade and worked the mines for 2 seasons before enlisting in the United States Air Force in February of 1949. The recruiting sergeant in Phoenix had glanced at his arithmetic test scores and recommended him for radar maintenance training. He spent the Korean War on the ground at Suwon Air Base in South Korea, calibrating early warning radar sets and learning slowly and carefully that the human eye and the radar return often disagreed, and that the disagreement was almost always interesting. He was honorably discharged in 1953 with a corporal's stripes and a habit of writing things down. He returned to Arizona, married a schoolteacher named Ada Whitlock in the spring of 1955, and joined the Pinal County Sheriff's Department as a deputy that same summer. His superiors found him quiet, methodical, and incapable of being rushed. His witnesses found him courteous. His arrests found him patient. He made a deputy sergeant in 1962 after 7 years of unspectacular but flawless work, and was appointed acting sheriff in March of 1967 when the elected sheriff, an older man named Boyd Pellington, died of a stroke at his desk on a Saturday afternoon. The county commission held an interim election that autumn, and Hollis Tate ran unopposed. He was sworn in on the first Monday of November 1967. His wife Ada had died of pancreatic cancer 2 years before he became sheriff. He had no children. He lived alone in a small adobe house on the western edge of Florence, Arizona, drove a 1965 Plymouth Belvedere department car when on duty, and a 1958 Ford F-100 pickup when off duty, kept a small garden of tomatoes and chiles in his back lot, and observed Sunday at the Methodist Church on Main Street, even though he had stopped praying around the time his wife had stopped breathing. His office in the Pinal County Courthouse was on the 2nd floor, 2 doors down from the county clerk's office. It contained a metal desk, a wooden filing cabinet, an upright royal typewriter, a glass ashtray he never used, and a Korean War-era brass binocular case that he kept on the windowsill behind his chair. By the summer of 1968, he was 38 years old. He was, by every measure that the citizens of Pinal County understood, the kind of sheriff a small county in central Arizona produced when it was lucky. What none of them knew yet, what he himself did not yet know, was that his radar training, his habit of writing things down, his disinclination to be rushed, and the geographic accident of his county's location were about to make him, for one specific subject, the most thoroughly accurate observer in the western United States. The first call came at 1:47 in the morning on August 12, 1968. The dispatch deputy was a woman named Imogene Bidwell. The same county clerk Hollis would work alongside for the next 21 years, and she put the caller through to the sheriff's home line because the caller had asked for him by name. The voice on the other end was a rancher named Victor Calloway, from a stretch of grazing land outside the small town of Kearney, on the eastern edge of the county. Calloway said 3 words first. He said, "Sheriff, I'm sober." Then he described what he had seen. 3 orange points of light arranged in a triangle, perfectly stationary at first, hovering above his upper pasture for 7 minutes. Then a slow horizontal drift to the east. Then a sudden vertical rise that, according to Calloway, would have required acceleration that no aircraft he had ever seen could have produced. Then nothing. He had stood in his doorway with his rifle in his hand for 40 minutes after the lights vanished. He had finally walked out into the pasture with a flashlight and found a circle of singed grass approximately 12 feet in diameter near the fence line. He had returned to the house, drunk 1 cup of coffee, and called the sheriff. Hollis took the address, told Calloway to leave the burned ring alone until he arrived, and drove the Plymouth out to Kearney in the pre-dawn darkness. He arrived at 4:30. He spent the next 3 hours photographing the site with his department Polaroid, measuring the diameter of the burned ring with a fabric tape, taking soil samples in 2 glass canning jars he had borrowed from Calloway's wife, and writing a careful account of Calloway's story in a steno notebook he kept in the glove compartment. He drove home as the sky lightened and the saguaro shadows stretched east. He did not file the report as a weather balloon. He typed up a 15-page account at his Royal typewriter, dated it August 13th, 1968, and put it in a manila folder he labeled simply Calloway V. He bought a second filing cabinet at a thrift store in Florence 3 days later and put it in the corner of his courthouse office. He labeled the top drawer A through L and the bottom drawer M through Z in his neat block printing. The first folder he placed in the cabinet was the Calloway folder. 3 weeks later, on September 4th, the dispatch put through a similar call from a copper mine night shift foreman near the town of Superior. 6 lights this time. White, stationary for an hour, then gone. Hollis drove out at 7 the next morning and added a folder labeled Pierce, M, to the cabinet. On October 11th, a school bus driver named Lila Hostetter called from outside Coolidge to report a single silver disk reflecting moonlight above the Gila River. No sound, drifting south for perhaps 4 minutes. Hollis drove out, took her statement, and added a folder. By December of 1968, the cabinet contained 11 folders. The 38-year-old sheriff bought a hardbound ledger at a stationery store in Florence and wrote on the first page in his neat hand, Pinal County Anomalous-Light Index. Started August 12, 1968 by H. Tate. Below it, he ruled 4 columns, date, location, witness name, brief description. He cross-referenced each entry to the corresponding manila folder by a sequential index number. On the inside of the back cover, he glued a folded sheet of butcher paper on which he began drawing a map of the county. He marked each report with a red ink dot. By February of 1969, the dots were not random. They were forming a corridor running from northwest to southeast, approximately 4 miles wide, crossing the county along a line that paralleled the Gila River and bisected the eastern half of the basin. He would not understand for another 4 years that the corridor he was drawing was the same corridor that the Phoenix Lights would follow at low altitude on the evening of March 13, 1997. By the spring of 1971, the Pinal County Sheriff's Department contained 117 sworn officers and civilian staff. Of those, the people who worked in the second-floor courthouse offices noticed first. Imogene Bidwell, the county clerk, had been routing the late-night calls to Hollis for nearly 3 years, and had begun, without being asked, to maintain a separate log of which ranchers had called more than once. She handed it to him the morning of February 9th, 1971, with the words, "I figured you'd want this," and went back to her desk without waiting for a response. The undersheriff, a heavy-set man named Lester Brennan, who had been deputy for 26 years and had no ambition beyond his pension, found the second filing cabinet during an inventory check in March 1971 and asked about it. Hollis told him truthfully what was in it. Brennan stared at him for a long moment, opened his mouth, closed it, and walked out without saying anything. He never mentioned the cabinet again to Hollis directly. He mentioned it to the deputy sergeants in the break room within the hour. By summer of 1971, the entire department was aware. The dispatchers called it Tate's bestiary. The patrol deputies, on slow nights, would joke that the sheriff was running a parallel investigation into Martian smuggling. Most of the joking was good-natured. Some of it was not. A young deputy named Doyle Renfro, 26 years old, recently hired from the military police at Fort Huachuca after 6 years in the Army, made the cabinet a regular target of his diner conversation at the Florence Cafe. Renfro was tall, clean-shaven, sharp-faced, and had what his contemporaries described as an instinct for which way the wind in a room was blowing. He had decided, within his first 6 months at the department, that Hollis Tate was a placeholder sheriff, that the cabinet of folders was a public weakness, and that he himself intended to be the next elected sheriff of Pinal County. He began saying so, in indirect ways, to people who would carry it back. The county commission heard about the cabinet in the autumn of 1971. The chairman, a rancher and former state senator named Curtis Pelletier, asked Hollis about it during a routine budget meeting in October. Hollis told him plainly. Pelletier nodded slowly, did not pursue it, and the matter went no further at the commission level for another 2 years. The local paper of record was the Pinal County Dispatch, a 4-page weekly published out of a small office in Casa Grande, and read by approximately 8,000 subscribers across the county. Its city editor in 1971 was a man named Floyd Marston, 3 years from retirement, who had no interest in the sheriff's filing habits and assigned no one to look into them. But the paper had recently hired a young general assignment reporter, 23 years old, fresh out of Arizona State University, with a journalism degree and a clear ambition for the Phoenix dailies. His name was Marlin Hessler. He had been at the Dispatch for 9 months. He had heard the courthouse jokes about the sheriff's UFO files. He had not yet decided what to do with them. Marlin Hessler was the second of 3 sons of a Phoenix banker. He had grown up in the leafy older streets of central Phoenix, attended Arizona State on a partial academic scholarship, and graduated in the spring of 1971 with a degree in journalism, a 3.4 GPA, and the conviction that his career was going to take him to the Arizona Republic in Phoenix, and from there, eventually, to a serious Eastern paper. The job at the Pinal County Dispatch was a placeholder, the kind of small paper credit one accumulated for 2 years before the Metro Daily would consider an application. He was 23 years old, 6 feet tall, thin and clean-shaven. He wore narrow black ties and white button-down shirts to the office, kept his dark hair short and oiled, and carried a leather notepad in his shirt pocket the way other men carried cigarettes. He had not yet figured out what story would carry him to Phoenix. He had been searching for it since his first day. In the fall of 1971, he heard, in the same diner conversations every other person at the courthouse heard, that the sheriff of Pinal County maintained a private filing cabinet of UFO reports. He understood within 30 seconds of hearing it that this was the story. He was not personally interested in unidentified aerial phenomena. He was interested in what the appearance of a sheriff investigating them would do for a young reporter's byline. He spent the next 18 months gathering material. He interviewed deputies. He interviewed dispatchers. He interviewed 2 ranchers who had called Hollis to make reports. He drove out to the Calloway property, met Vic Calloway in the same upper pasture, and recorded a careful interview on a portable cassette recorder, in which Calloway repeated, in detail, the description of the 3 orange lights from August 1968. Hessler wrote in his own notebook after the interview the single sentence, "He believes it." The trick is to make him sound like he believes it because he's broken. He approached Doyle Renfro in the spring of 1972 at a county BBQ. Renfro was now a sergeant. The 2 men were exactly the same age, exactly the same height, and exactly aligned in their assessment of Hollis Tate as a man whose career could be quietly disassembled in service of their own ambitions. Renfro provided Hessler with on-the-record quotes. Hessler provided Renfro with a sympathetic profile in the same paper 6 months later, treating the new sergeant as a no-nonsense modernizer. Their arrangement was never spoken aloud and never needed to be. Both men were patient. Both men understood that Hessler's piece on the sheriff would need to be exactly right, exactly fair-sounding, exactly devastating. Hessler took 18 months to write it. The first draft was complete in February of 1973. He revised it 4 times. The piece ran on the front page of the Pinal County Dispatch on the morning of Wednesday, April 4, 1973. The headline ran in 3 deck lines across the front page in 18-point bold. Pinal County's UFO Sheriff. Hollis Tate's secret cabinet of flying saucer files. Is he working too hard or just too late? Beneath it ran a photograph of Hollis taken without his permission 6 weeks earlier. Hessler had walked into the courthouse office on a Tuesday afternoon under the pretense of asking about a stolen tractor, had positioned himself at an angle, and had quietly removed a Pentax camera from his shoulder bag while Hollis was reading a routine memorandum. The photograph showed the sheriff looking up from his desk with an expression of mild, slow-blinking surprise. The cabinet was visible in the corner. The cut line read, Sheriff Hollis Tate at his desk in the Pinal County Courthouse, with the second filing cabinet of UFO reports visible at right. The article itself was 3,000 words long and ran across pages 1, 3, and 5. It was, at the level of journalistic technique, expertly constructed. It quoted Hollis accurately. It quoted Vic Calloway in a way that made him sound rural, simple, and unwell. It quoted the school bus driver, Lila Hostetter, in a way that made her sound elderly, although she was 41. It quoted Doyle Renfro twice, including the sentence that Hessler had spent 2 months extracting from him in workshopped form. I think Hollis is working real hard. Maybe too hard. Maybe his eyes are seeing things at night that aren't really there. It quoted Lester Brennan, the undersheriff on background, saying that the cabinet is not departmental policy and was not approved by anyone in this office. It cited multiple sheriff's department sources, all speaking on condition of anonymity. It mentioned, in a single carefully constructed paragraph in the middle of page 3, that the sheriff's wife had died of cancer 8 years before, and that the sheriff had not remarried. The implication was made, and not stated. It was the most professionally executed piece of small paper hatchet work that had ever appeared in the Pinal County Dispatch. It was picked up by the Arizona Republic in Phoenix the following Sunday. It ran in condensed form in the Metro section on April 8, 1973, under the headline, "Arizona Sheriff Keeps Secret UFO Files." It was picked up by United Press International on the wire the next morning. By Wednesday, April 11th, papers in Tucson, Albuquerque, El Paso, Las Vegas, San Diego, and Sacramento had all reproduced some version of the story. Hollis Tate received 17 pieces of mail from out-of-state strangers within 10 days. He received 4 phone calls from television news producers in Phoenix and Tucson, and one from a producer at the CBS Evening News in New York. He returned none of them. The Pinal County Commission convened a special closed session on April 16th. Curtis Pelletier presided. The vote, 3-2, ordered Sheriff Tate to discontinue any and all departmental records of phenomena that are not the subject of recognized criminal investigation, and to refrain from creating reports that imply official county endorsement of unverified events. Hollis received the written order on April 19th. He read it twice. He typed a one-line response. Order received and acknowledged. Compliance effective immediately. He filed the order in a new manila folder labeled Commission, Pinal County, 1973. That evening, after the courthouse had emptied, he carried the contents of the second filing cabinet, drawer by drawer, down the back stairs and out to his pickup. He drove the cabinet home. He installed it in the spare bedroom of his adobe house in Florence and bolted it to the wall. He did not stop the work. He stopped reporting it. The anomalous-light index, which by April of 1973 contained 193 numbered entries, was now a private record in a private house, unsanctioned by any government, unsupported by any institution, and maintained, from that month forward, entirely on his own time and his own salary. If you have ever known someone who was right and ridiculed for it, someone who kept doing the work anyway after the world had laughed at them, leave a comment with their name. Hit that subscribe button so we can keep telling stories like this one. Because what Hollis Tate did over the next 24 years, after the cabinet came home and the work went private, is the part of this story that no one in Pinal County would learn about until the morning of March the 14th, 1997. The official record of Hollis Tate's tenure as sheriff of Pinal County between April of 1973 and his retirement in January of 1989 contains nothing related to unidentified aerial phenomena. The anomalous-light index, however, continued. Between April 20th, 1973, and December 31st, 1988, Hollis added 684 numbered entries to the ledger, bringing the total to 877. The reports came from the same network of ranchers, miners, and night shift workers who had been calling him since 1968. They learned, by word of mouth, that the sheriff would no longer take the call at the office, but that he would take the call at his home line in Florence after dinner, and that he would still drive out at sunrise to look at any physical evidence, and would still write a careful account at his royal typewriter. The witnesses respected his discretion. None of them, in 15 years, leaked a single word of his ongoing work to anyone outside their own circle. The 1973 article had taught them something about the press that no editorial could have taught them. They closed ranks around the sheriff who had taken their calls. The cabinet in his spare bedroom grew. He bought a third cabinet in 1976 and a fourth in 1981. He upgraded the index ledger from a single hardbound book to a numbered series of 3. He purchased a Hallicrafter's S-38E shortwave receiver at a Tucson swap meet in 1977 and used it on weekends to monitor military aviation frequencies in the corridor between Davis-Monthan and Luke. He kept careful logs of which frequencies were active during sighting events and which were silent. He made no attempt to publish his findings. He spoke to no journalists. He attended no UFO conferences. The civilian UFO research community, which by the late 1970s included groups like the Mutual UFO Network and the Center for UFO Studies, did not know he existed. He was, deliberately and patiently, a private archive of one. In November of 1980, the new generation of deputies, led by Doyle Renfro, who had been promoted to lieutenant in 1978, began openly discussing whether to challenge Tate in the upcoming 1984 election. Renfro decided to wait one more cycle. In November of 1984, Hollis ran for re-election, his fourth term, and won by 64% against a token challenger. In 1988, Renfro ran. The campaign was conducted with elaborate civility. Renfro did not mention the UFO files publicly even once. He did not need to. The Pinal County Dispatch, now under a different city editor, but with Marlin Hessler's 1973 article still in its bound archives, ran a candidate profile on Renfro that referred admiringly to his modern, evidence-based investigative philosophy. Hollis Tate read the profile in his kitchen, folded the paper, and went out to feed his garden. He gave one campaign speech at the Florence VFW. He spent $40,000 of his own money on his campaign. Renfro spent $200,000. The election was held on November 8, 1988. Renfro won with 61% of the vote. Hollis Tate left the courthouse on the afternoon of January 6, 1989, with 3 cardboard boxes of personal items, a brass binocular case, and the 4 filing cabinets of UFO reports already gone, having been moved over the previous 4 weekends to a small adobe storage shed behind a property he had purchased in October on the dirt road outskirts of Coolidge, Arizona, 12 acres on a low rise with views east toward the Superstition Mountains and northwest toward the lights of Phoenix on the horizon. He was 59 years old. The official record of his career, as preserved in the county courthouse, ended with a brief departmental statement. The other record, the one no one knew about to enter its most productive phase. In the spring of 1990, Hollis Tate built the cedar observation shed himself. He chose the highest point on his 12 acres, a small flat rise approximately 300 feet behind the main house, with unobstructed visibility to the northwest, north, and northeast. He cut the cedar planking from a load he bought in Globe and hauled in his pickup. He laid a concrete pad 8 feet by 10 feet. He framed the walls with 2x4s, sheathed them in cedar, and covered the roof in galvanized steel. He installed a single window on the south wall and cut a square sky panel into the roof, hinged on the north edge so it could be raised manually with a wooden prop. He framed a wooden desk under the panel and bolted a small Franklin-style wood-burning stove to the floor in the corner. He ran a single electrical line from the house and installed one bare bulb on a pull chain. He moved his 4 filing cabinets, the index ledgers, the shortwave radio, and a 1958 Underwood typewriter from the storage shed into the cedar shed in May of 1990. He bought a used Bushnell 7x35 binocular at an estate sale in Mesa for $34 and hung it on a leather strap from a nail on the inside of the door. He purchased a Polaroid 600 camera at a hardware store in Coolidge and stockpiled 12 packs of film. The shed was operational by the first week of June 1990. He was 60 years old. He kept regular hours. He walked up to the shed at 9 each evening and remained there until 2 or 3 in the morning, working at the desk, recording observations, transcribing phone interviews onto cassette, and updating the index ledger. He took calls from the network of ranchers and miners on a second telephone line he had installed for that purpose. The network had aged with him. Vic Calloway was now 72. Lila Hosteder was 61. The night shift hospital worker from Casa Grande, a woman named Frances Whitlock who had been calling since 1972, was approaching retirement. New witnesses joined as the older ones aged out. By the end of 1995, the index contained 1,143 numbered entries. The wall map of Pinal County was now a wall map of central Arizona, expanded to include the southern half of Maricopa County, the northern half of Pima County, and a portion of Gila County. The red ink dots had been replaced when he installed them with proper red push pins. He maintained 4 colors of pin: red for triangle formations, blue for single craft sightings, green for stationary lights without motion, and yellow for sightings with multiple craft in non-formation patterns. The corridor was unmistakable. It ran from the western edge of the Superstition Mountains, southwest across the Gila River Basin, across the southern fringe of the Phoenix metropolitan area, and out into the open desert toward the Sonoran border. The pin density along this corridor was approximately 12 times the density elsewhere on the map. The seasonal pattern, which Hollis had begun to suspect in 1979 and had quantified by 1986, showed a consistent peak in March of each year, a smaller peak in late September, and lower frequencies in summer and winter. He did not know what the corridor represented. He did not speculate. He documented. He had, by the early 90s, abandoned the question of what was producing the sightings and had committed himself entirely to the question of where and when. The where was the corridor. The when, increasingly, was March. He noted in his ledger on December 31st, 1996, that he expected the next major sighting cluster to occur in mid-March of 1997. He had no specific evidence for the date. He had only the pattern of 28 previous Marches. He was 66 years old. The evening of Thursday, March the 13th, 1997, was unseasonably warm in central Arizona. The high temperature in Phoenix had reached 87 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees above the seasonal average. The sky cleared as the sun set. By 7 o'clock, the temperature had dropped to 72 degrees, and visibility was excellent in every direction. At 7:55 p.m., the first call to a public agency came from a man named Tim Lay in Henderson, Nevada, north of the Arizona border, who reported a V-shaped formation of 5 amber lights moving south at low altitude. By 8:10 p.m., similar reports were coming in from Prescott. By 8:30 p.m., the formation, now estimated by various witnesses at between 1,200 feet and a mile across, had crossed Wickenburg and was moving over the western edge of the Phoenix metropolitan area. Witnesses on the ground in Glendale, Peoria, and West Phoenix described a single craft of immense size, completely silent, with 5 large amber lights along its leading edge, moving slowly south-southeast at perhaps 30 miles per hour at an altitude that some estimated at 1,500 feet. Approximately 10,000 witnesses across the metropolitan area would eventually be confirmed as having seen the 8 o'clock formation. At 9:55 p.m., approximately 90 minutes after the V formation had passed out of the metropolitan area into the open desert south of Phoenix, a separate event occurred. A row of stationary amber lights appeared in the sky south of the South Mountain Range, holding position for approximately 15 minutes before disappearing one at a time. This second event was witnessed by additional thousands of people in the southeastern Phoenix metropolitan area. Hollis Tate was on his porch in Coolidge at 8:23 p.m. when the V formation crossed the western horizon, north and slightly west of his position. He saw it for approximately 4 minutes. He timed the duration on his wristwatch. He estimated the bearing at 310 degrees from his porch and the elevation above the horizon at approximately 22 degrees. He did not photograph it. He had run out of Polaroid film 3 days earlier and had not yet replaced it. He went inside, sat at his kitchen table, and began making notes in pencil on a yellow legal pad. By 8:45 p.m., his second telephone line, the one connected to the ranchers and miners and night shift workers, began to ring. The first call was from a retired ranch hand named Wendell Ash, who lived north of Florence and had been a witness in his index since 1971. Ash described the formation. Hollis took the call in the kitchen, took a second one immediately after from a copper mine night foreman in Superior, took a third from a widow named Esther Galbraith in Globe, and by 10 o'clock had taken 9 calls and had moved to the cedar observation shed with the legal pad and a fresh cassette tape in the recorder. He took 8 more calls between 10 and 12. The 17th call, at 11:43 p.m., was from his old original witness, Vic Calloway, now 81 years old and using a portable oxygen concentrator, calling from his daughter's house in Mesa. Calloway said 2 sentences. He said, "It came down the corridor, Sheriff. It came right down the same corridor." Then he said, "I told you in 68. Hollis said, "Yes, sir, you did." He sat at the desk in the cedar shed for another hour after the calls stopped. At 1:15 a.m. on March 14, 1997, he wrote in the index ledger in his neat hand the entry numbered 1247. Date, March 13, 1997. Approximate time, 1955 to 22:30. Location, continuous corridor, multi-county, Henderson, Nevada, through Maricopa, Arizona through Pinal, Arizona. Description: V formation, low altitude, silent, southbound, single body or close array craft, 5 primary amber lights. Followed at plus 1 hour 35 minutes by stationary array, South Mountain Range, 15-minute hold. Notes: this is the highest magnitude data point in the corridor record. The pattern dating to August 12, 1968 has produced its terminal verification. He turned out the bare bulb in the cedar shed at 1:25. He walked back down the rise to the house. He slept 4 hours. At sunrise he made coffee and went out to the front porch and waited. He had a quiet certainty, 66 years deep, that someone was going to come up the dirt driveway that morning and ask him a question. The 48 hours after the night of March 13th were a study in institutional misdirection. The Phoenix area news affiliates received hundreds of calls beginning before 9 p.m. on the night itself. The morning newscasts of Friday, March 14th led with the story. The Arizona Republic ran a front-page article quoting 21 named witnesses. Phoenix television station KPNX produced a graphic showing the approximate flight path of the 8 o'clock formation. The reaction of the relevant institutions was at first cautious, then defensive, then mocking. Luke Air Force Base, contacted at 6 a.m. on March 14th, issued a brief statement that no Luke aircraft had been operating in the relevant airspace at the relevant time. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson issued a similar statement. The Arizona National Guard issued a statement that no Guard aircraft had been operating. The Federal Aviation Administration, contacted later that afternoon, indicated that radar tapes from Sky Harbor International Airport showed nothing unusual. The Maryland-based Air National Guard 104th Fighter Wing, then operating temporarily out of Davis-Monthan on a training rotation, did eventually disclose, weeks later, that they had dropped illumination flares over the Barry M. Goldwater Range south of Phoenix sometime that evening. But the timing of those flares aligned only with the second event at 9:55 p.m., and not with the 8 o'clock V formation, and the geographic location of the flare drops was approximately 40 miles south of where the second event had been witnessed. The institutional explanation that subsequently emerged in the press, conflating the two events into a single flare drop, was not consistent with the testimony of the witnesses, the geography of the events, or the timing of the second event. On June 19, 1997, 3 months after the event, the governor of Arizona, Fife Symington III, held a press conference in his office in Phoenix that had been billed as a serious response to the public's persistent questions about the Phoenix lights. He invited the press into the room. He announced gravely that he had identified the responsible party. The door behind him opened, and his chief of staff entered the room wearing a costume of an extraterrestrial being, complete with a silver jumpsuit and a rubber alien mask. The press laughed. The governor laughed. The press conference ended. The witnesses to the events of March 13th, who included pilots, police officers, retired military personnel, school teachers, and a former director of public works for the city of Phoenix, did not laugh. The governor would, 14 years later, in 2007, publicly acknowledge that he himself had been one of the witnesses to the 8 o'clock formation, that he had stood in the courtyard of his Phoenix home and watched it pass, that the costume gag had been intended to diffuse public anxiety, and that he regretted it. By June of 1997, the institutional explanation of flares had hardened into the official position. The witnesses were ridiculed in the same idioms that had been deployed against the Pinal County Sheriff in 1973, in the same paper, by some of the same writers. The Pinal County Dispatch, now 24 years removed from the Hessler hit piece, had a different city editor and a different staff. The original article was no longer in active memory in the newsroom. It existed only in the bound back-issue archive on a metal shelf in the basement of the Casa Grande building. A young reporter, 27 years old, 6 months out of journalism school at the University of Arizona, was about to walk down those basement stairs and find it. His name was Quinn Devereaux. He had been hired by the Pinal County Dispatch in October of 1996 as a general assignment reporter, the same entry-level position that Marlin Hessler had once occupied. He was 27 years old, the son of a Tucson optometrist and a high school English teacher, and he had wanted to be a working journalist since he was 11. He had taken the dispatch job because it was the only one that had been offered to him after graduation. He intended, like Hessler before him, to use it as a stepping stone to the Metro dailies. He differed from Hessler in 2 important ways. He was patient, and he was honest. The story of the Phoenix Lights had been covered by the Dispatch in the same way it had been covered by every other paper in the state for the first 6 weeks. By early May of 1997, the wire copy had thinned, and the local angles had been written. The city editor, a woman named Carmen Trevino, called Devereaux to her desk on the afternoon of Wednesday, May 7th. She told him that the paper needed a follow-up local color piece tied to the lights, a Pinal County Sheriff's Office angle, since the lights had crossed the county on their southbound path. She told him to find something new. She gave him 5 days. Devereaux made his first call to the Pinal County Sheriff's Department on the morning of May 8th. He asked the dispatcher whether the department had received any calls during the night of March 13th that might be related. The dispatcher, a woman who had been with the department for 19 years, paused for a longer time than was normal on a routine information request. Then she said, "You should look up the old sheriff, the one before Renfro." Devereaux asked for a name. She gave him Hollis Tate. She gave him no other information. Devereaux returned to the dispatch building and went down to the basement archive. He pulled the bound volume for April 1973. He found the front page of the April 4th, 1973 edition. He read the Hessler article twice. He stood in the basement for a full minute, holding the bound volume. He went back upstairs and asked Carmen Trevino about the article. She had not been at the paper in 1973. She told him to look into it carefully. Devereaux made one more phone call. He called the Pinal County Tax Assessor's office and asked for the address of the property owned by Hollis Tate. The clerk gave him a dirt road address on the outskirts of Coolidge. He drove out at 6 the following morning, Friday, May 9th. The drive from Casa Grande took 35 minutes. He turned off the highway onto a graded dirt road, drove for another 2 miles, and saw a small adobe house on a low rise with a cedar outbuilding on the higher ground behind it. There was a man on the porch. The man was watching him approach. The man was 67 years old, wearing a faded olive-drab military surplus field jacket, a brown felt rancher's hat, and a pair of binoculars on a leather strap around his neck. The dirt drive was a 1/4 mile long. Devereaux drove it slowly. He parked. He reached for his microcassette recorder. He stepped out. He climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch. He said, "Sheriff Tate?" The man nodded once. Devereaux said, "I'd like to ask you about your files." The sheriff looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Come inside, son." They sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes before they went out to the cedar shed. Hollis Tate poured coffee from a stovetop percolator into 2 ceramic mugs, set out a small pitcher of evaporated milk, and listened to the young reporter's questions in silence for 3 or 4 minutes before he answered any of them. Quinn Devereaux had begun by asking about the 1973 article. Hollis nodded once, said yes, that had been written about him, said the writer's name had been Marlin Hessler. He made no further comment. Devereaux asked about the cabinet that had been mentioned in the article. Hollis said the cabinet still existed. Devereaux asked whether the work had continued after 1973. Hollis said yes. Devereaux asked how much. Hollis set down his coffee mug, looked at the young reporter for the first time directly, and said, "I'll show you." He stood, took his binoculars from the kitchen counter, hung them around his neck, and led the reporter out the back door of the house and up the gravel path to the cedar shed. The shed had been operational for 7 years by then, and Hollis had not invited any other living person inside it during that time. He unlocked the door with a brass key from his pocket. He pushed the door open. He stepped aside. Devereaux walked in. The interior was 28 feet square, and lit at that hour by a single bare bulb hanging from a pull chain. The 4 filing cabinets stood against the north wall. The wall map covered the east wall, 8 feet wide and 5 feet tall, stuck with 1,247 small colored pushpins. The desk under the sky panel held the index ledger and the Underwood typewriter. The Hallicrafter's shortwave radio sat on a shelf above the desk. The fireproof safe stood in the corner near the wood stove, 4 feet tall, painted slate gray, with a brass combination dial. Devereaux stood in the middle of the room and did not speak for 30 seconds. Then he said, "How long?" Hollis said, 29 years next August. Devereaux said, "How many reports?" Hollis walked to the desk, opened the leather-bound index ledger, and turned to the most recent page. He turned the ledger toward the reporter. The most recent entry was numbered 1,247. Hollis said, "That one was the night you're here to ask me about." Devereaux read the entry. He read the line that said, "This is the highest magnitude data point in the corridor record. The pattern dating to August 12, 1968 has produced its terminal verification." He looked up. Hollis took him to the wall map. He showed him the 4 colors of pin. He showed him the corridor running from the superstitions across the Gila Basin to the southwestern desert. He showed him the cluster of red and yellow pins along the line that the V formation of March 13th had followed almost exactly. He explained the seasonal pattern. He explained the March peak. He showed him the prediction note in the December 31st, 1996 entry that had said the next major event was likely to fall in mid-March of 1997. Devereaux switched on his microcassette recorder. He recorded the entire walkthrough. Hollis allowed it. Hollis opened the fireproof safe and removed 3 folders. He showed Devereaux the folder for the 1968 Callaway report, with the original Polaroids of the singed circle in the pasture. He showed him the folder for the 1973 Hessler article, with the clipped front page of the Pinal County Dispatch and the typed one-line acknowledgement of the County Commission's order. He showed him the folder labeled Phoenix Corridor Composite Pattern Analysis, 1968 to 1996, with 17 pages of typed analysis in single-spaced Courier on the Underwood. He let Devereaux read all 3 folders front to back. The reporter read for 45 minutes without speaking. When he was done, he closed the last folder and looked at the old sheriff and said, "They mocked you." Hollis said, "Yes." Devereaux said, "You were right." Hollis said, "I was thorough. Whether I was right is a different question." Devereaux said, "May I write about this?" Hollis considered the question for a long minute. Then he said, "You may. But you'll write it carefully, and you'll quote me only on what I am willing to be quoted on." Devereaux said, "Yes, sir." Hollis said, "Then you may." The article ran on the front page of the Pinal County Dispatch on the morning of Wednesday, May 14, 1997. The headline ran in 3 decklines, 24-point bold. Pinal County Sheriff's UFO files predicted Phoenix Light's pattern. Records show 29-year documentation of March corridor events. Retired Sheriff Hollis Tate's private archive contains 1,247 indexed reports. The article ran 4,500 words across the front page and the entire third page. It included 3 photographs taken by Devereaux with the sheriff's permission. One showed the cedar shed exterior. One showed the wall map. One showed Hollis at his desk under the open sky panel, his face partly in shadow, the brass binoculars on the leather strap around his neck. The article quoted Hollis Tate 16 times, all on factual matters about the index methodology. It did not quote him on what he believed the lights to be. It noted, in a single, careful paragraph on the front page, that the original 1973 article by Marlin Hessler that had publicly mocked the sheriff's filing system was reproduced in full as a sidebar on page 3. It was the first work of Quinn Devereaux's career, and the most thoroughly reported piece the Pinal County Dispatch had published in 20 years. The Arizona Republic ran a condensed version on the front page of the Sunday edition, May 18th, with all 3 of Devereaux's photographs. The Tucson Citizen ran an even more thorough version on May 21st. By the end of May, papers in 12 states had reproduced or referenced the story. National Public Radio's All Things Considered ran a 4-minute segment on June 2nd. Marlin Hessler was now 50 years old. He had left the Pinal County Dispatch in 1976. He had worked at the Arizona Republic from 1976 to 1985, never reaching the eastern paper of his ambitions, and had taken a public relations job with the Phelps Dodge Copper Mining Corporation in Phoenix in 1986. He had risen to communications director by 1993. He read the May 14th Dispatch article in the lobby of the Phelps Dodge building on the morning of its publication, called his secretary, told her to cancel his afternoon, and drove home. He called Hollis Tate's number that evening. The number rang 9 times. There was no answer. He called again the following evening. Same. He never reached him. He wrote a letter, 4 pages, longhand, on personal stationery in October of 1997. He mailed it to the Coolidge address. He never received a response. The original 1973 article remained in the bound archive in the basement of the Casa Grande building. Hessler died of pancreatic cancer in 2014. He never wrote about Hollis Tate again. Doyle Renfro had lost his sheriff's seat in 1992 in an unrelated scandal involving the misappropriation of asset forfeiture funds. He had pled guilty to a misdemeanor, paid a fine, and been barred from law enforcement employment in the state of Arizona. He had been operating a small private security company in Casa Grande at the time of the May 1997 Devereaux article. A reporter from the Arizona Republic reached him for comment for the May 18th condensed version. Renfro spoke for less than 30 seconds. He said, "Hollis was always more thorough than I was. I should have said so at the time. I'm sorry I didn't." That sentence was the only public statement Doyle Renfro ever made about Hollis Tate. He retired in 2003 and died in 2011. The original 1973 article does not appear in his obituary. By the autumn of 1997, the National UFO Reporting Center, an independent civilian organization based in Davenport, Washington, had requested copies of the Pinal County Index. Hollis sent them photocopies of the entire ledger and a sample of 40 representative manila folders, retaining the originals. The Mutual UFO Network sent 2 researchers to the Cedar Shed in October. He gave them 4 hours of his time, allowed them to photograph the wall map, and answered their methodological questions in detail. He declined their invitation to address the 1998 International UFO Congress in Laughlin, Nevada. He declined a similar invitation to the Society for Scientific Exploration in Boulder, Colorado. He gave one further interview, a follow-up profile to Quinn Devereaux for the Pinal County Dispatch in November 1997, in which he answered for the first time questions about his Korean War radar experience and its influence on his sheriff's office methodology. He gave no further interviews after that. The Florence Café, the same diner where Doyle Renfro had once joked about the sheriff's bestiary, hung a framed copy of the May 14, 1997, Dispatch front page on its back wall in the autumn of 1998. The frame was made by a local cabinet maker named Hap Westbrook, who had been one of the witnesses in the index since 1981. It still hangs there. The Pinal County Courthouse, where Hollis had served as sheriff for 22 years, did not formally acknowledge the May 1997 article. The county commission, which in 1973 had ordered him to discontinue the work, did not pass a corrective resolution. No street, building, or county facility was renamed in his honor. The county website, when it was launched in 2002, included a brief biographical entry for him in the historical section that mentioned his service dates and his retirement, and made no reference to the index. The Pinal County Sheriff's Office, under Renfro's successor, formally adopted in February of 1999 a written policy on the receipt and documentation of citizen reports of anomalous phenomena. The policy was 3 pages long. It specified that all such reports would be taken in good faith, recorded in the standard report format, and retained in the departmental archive. The author of the policy, a young undersheriff named Ray Cothran, sent a copy to Hollis Tate at his Coolidge address with a note that read, in its entirety, "We did this because of you." Sheriff Tate did not reply, but he placed the policy in a new manila folder in the cedar shed labeled Pinal County Sheriff's Office, Anomalous Phenomena Reporting Policy, February 1999. The folder remains in the archive. The visitors who came to the cedar shed in the years after 1997, researchers, graduate students, 3 documentary filmmakers, 2 more journalists from out of state, all received the same hospitality. They were given coffee at the kitchen table. They were taken up the gravel path. They were shown the wall map. They were quoted carefully, only on what Hollis was willing to be quoted on. They left, as Devereaux had left, with a clearer view of what had been quietly preserved for them. Hollis Tate continued the observation work from the cedar shed for another 6 years. The index, which had stood at 1,247 entries on the night of March 13, 1997, grew to 1,360 by the end of his life. He died of natural causes on the evening of October 21, 2004, at the age of 75. He was found by Hap Westbrook, the cabinet maker, who came up the dirt road on a routine Wednesday visit, and discovered him sitting upright in the porch chair, a cup of coffee on the small table beside him, the brass binocular case in his lap. The will Hollis had filed with a Casa Grande attorney in 1998 specified, in a single typed paragraph, that the entire contents of the Cedar Observation Shed were to be donated to the National UFO Reporting Center, with the further provision that the wall map, the index ledgers, and the original Polaroid archive would remain together as a single unit and not be separated. The donation was completed in March of 2005. The collection is cataloged today in the National UFO Reporting Center's permanent archive as the Tate Pinal County Index, accession number TPCI-2005-001 through TPCI-2005-1360. It is regarded by civilian UFO researchers as one of the most thorough multi-decade single-observer rural records in North American documentation. The pattern Hollis identified, the corridor running from the superstitions across the Gila Basin into the southwestern desert, with seasonal peaks in March and late September, has continued to be observable in the post-1997 reports gathered by other researchers. The corridor has been independently confirmed in 3 subsequent civilian studies. The cedar shed itself was disassembled in 2007 and reconstructed in a private museum in Mesa. The wall map remains intact. The red and yellow and green and blue pushpins are in the same positions where the sheriff placed them. Quinn Devereaux did eventually go to a Metro daily, the San Francisco Chronicle, in 2001, where he covered general assignment for 14 years before becoming an investigative editor. He has said in interviews that the May 14, 1997 article remains the work he is most proud of. He visited Hollis Tate every March until the sheriff's death, and once more alone in March of 2005 after the cedar shed had been emptied. The 1973 Hessler article is no longer cited. The 1997 Devereaux article is. Hollis Tate refused to accept that what he was watching was nothing. He kept doing the work after he had been ordered to stop. He was right, and he was patient, and he was alone, and the world that had laughed at him for 24 years finally caught up to him in a single night above an Arizona corridor he had been watching, by himself, since the summer of 1968. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Quiet vindication is rare. It deserves to be remembered.